Is the United States of America right to do only a diplomatic boycott of next year's Olympics in Beijing, China? Or does that not go far enough? How about what's happening at UPenn with the women's swim team and a trans athlete that is making waves? We're going to talk about that and more today with two very special guests. Eli Bremer, 2008 Olympian, the last time the Olympics were held in Beijing, and Riley Scott herself, a Pac-12 swim champion. Jimmy at the Crossroads with Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Get started right now.
Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate the time. So I want to jump into two stories. First with you, Eli. We just got news yesterday. We're recording this on Tuesday. Yesterday about a settlement, $380 million settlement with Nassar victims that would be with the Olympics. Can you refresh us on what this story was about and what we now know about a settlement that had been reached?
Well, yeah, Jimmy, going into the 2016 Olympic Games, Rachel Den Hollander, a very brave woman, reached out to the Indy Star with a story about a gymnastics doctor who she believed had been sexually molesting a number of gymnasts, including her. That opened up Pandora's box in the Olympics as we discovered the horrors of the Nassar situation. I've been involved at the time. I've been questioning the business structure of the Olympics, and I'd said I think that the business structure is conducive to some pretty bad outcomes, including abusive relationships with athletes. Over the next couple of years, we uncovered a lot more. There have been thousands of victims in the sports of swimming and in taekwondo and rowing now, we know as well. And there's been a huge effort to reform the Olympics. The Olympics are a government-sanctioned monopoly. To reform the Olympics and be able to have an Olympic committee and a sports system in America that actually works to protect young athletes and that fosters a great athleticism of our youth without putting them at risk for sexual assaults or physical abuse or things like that. This is not the end. The gymnasts were about 300 victims of well into the thousands that are known. There's a lot of work left to do. I appreciate that you've been on board with this. You were at a press conference a few years ago with me and Nancy Hogshead and Corey Gardner and Diana DeGette. This is a bipartisan issue. And so the settlement that was reached with the gymnasts is hopefully the beginning of the end, but it's definitely not the end.
Yeah, when we look at this, it really is a saga, and it's hard to call it that, but it's true. I talked some time ago with you and one of the judges who sentenced Larry Nassar, Judge Rosemarie Aquilina, on this very program some time back, Eli Bremer, and it is heart-wrenching to see that the Olympic Committee seems not to be on the ball nearly enough, certainly not with reforms or in any eagerness to improve itself, even as the United States Senate and Congress last year made some significant reforms in terms of a committee that they put together. Just talk to us a little bit about that effort that you've been one of the leaders of to really work on reforms to address some of these concerns about the Olympics and how poorly they have handled crises like Nassar.
Well, Jimmy, this goes to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is that the Olympics were set up as a monopoly by Congress, but they were given no oversight. And monopolies can't self-govern because they cause problems. And I've written extensively about this. I have a paper that's being published by Child USA about how the governance structure of sports leads to abuse. So we focused heavily on reforming the system. The reality of it is any monopoly that doesn't have outside governance will digress into this type of behavior. So when you look at traditional monopolies, utilities, companies, those are monopolies. They're overseen by an outside regulatory board. We don't have that in the Olympic Committee. And so there's still a lot more room that needs to be done. The governance structure is still wrong. And I think that Congress has more work to do over the next 2, 3, 4 years to prevent this from happening again.
Eli Bremer, speaking of the Olympics, we have next year's Olympics in Beijing, where you competed in 2008 on behalf of the United States. And there is a lot of talk about whether the U.S. doing a diplomatic boycott, what's called a diplomatic boycott, is enough. There are a lot of conservative politicians on the Republican side, especially, who've been very vocal in saying that they think that we shouldn't even compete in the Beijing Games. Of course, a week or so ago, the Biden administration announced that they would be doing a diplomatic boycott, and that was it, of the Beijing Games. Two-part question for you. What does a diplomatic boycott mean? And do you think that is an appropriate tool to exercise next year at the Olympics?
So a diplomatic boycott is when the government of the United States refuses to send over our diplomats to honor the Chinese government. A full boycott is if we refuse to send our athletes over to participate in the Olympics. The right thing is a diplomatic boycott, and the reason for that is there's multiple reasons. First of all, we already have a model from history. In 1980, we had in February the Miracle on Ice, where the U.S. team defeated the Soviet team in ice hockey, and it sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union. It was a very, very powerful tool for Americans to use. Then Jimmy Carter, who I think has recently been dethroned in his ineptitude on some of these issues, had declared a boycott of the Summer Olympics, and he pushed for a boycott, and that just led to all sorts of problems. It actually strengthened the Soviet Union. They turned around and boycotted America in the 1980 Olympic Games, so we don't have to guess what happens. I'm very glad that the Biden administration has not followed in the shoes of Jimmy Carter. They did the right thing with this and declared a diplomatic boycott. Now, what's actually going to happen is that the Chinese government and the Chinese people are not as integrated as the American government and the American people. So here in America, we have a government that is of the people, by the people, for the people. In China, they're really two different entities that kind of rotate around each other. And so by declaring a diplomatic boycott, we dishonor the government, but we don't dishonor the people. And that helps drive them apart. If we dishonor the government and the people, it drives them together. And when the Chinese government and the Chinese people are getting along, they do things like invade Taiwan. So I can't promise that they won't invade Taiwan still, but I can say if we did a full boycott, it would increase the propensity for them to do things like that.
It is interesting hearing some of the nation's foremost diplomats of recent years talk a different tune in terms of thinking that we should do an all-out boycott. Nikki Haley, former ambassador to the United Nations, said a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics is a joke. China doesn't care if Biden and team show up. They want our athletes. Mike Pompeo saying a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics is not enough. The CCP, Chinese Communist Party, doesn't give a rip about a diplomatic boycott because at the end of the day, they are still hosting the world's athletes. Joe Biden needs to stand up to the CCP. Hashtag boycott Beijing Olympics. That's the former U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Why do you think they are wrong on this particular issue?
So for all the reasons I just said, plus there's actually a technical component of this. The U.S. government has no formal means to force a full boycott. They spun off the Olympic Committee as an independent organization, a monopoly that they have very limited oversight of. And I've been critical of the lack of oversight. Ironically, we've had the sexual assault of thousands of young people in the Olympics, and Congress has been loath to actually oversee the organization. If you ask what is the technical mechanism for a full boycott, the Olympic Committee has the right to send or not send athletes. The only lever that Congress has is a lever that I helped give them with the passing of Senate Bill 2330 last year when it was signed into law by President Trump, that allows Congress, through a joint resolution of the House and the Senate, to dissolve the board of the Olympic Committee and reconstitute it. That's the only thing that they can do. And so the federal government lacks the statutory authority to actually implement this. So from a technical point of view, I think very few people understand the Olympic Sports Act, which is the law that governs the Olympics. But from a practical point of view, I have spent a lot of time in China. I've traveled all over China. I have a tremendous understanding of the people, how the government works. And again, we don't have to guess about what a full boycott does. We've actually seen it. So I think it makes great political fodder to call for a full boycott. But when you actually look at the tit for tat that China will play with us, other people have suggested, hey, we can just restart the Winter Olympics somewhere else. Well, that's actually not true. The athletes have to go test the venues for safety. People like my friend Katie Ulander, who's likely to compete in her 5th Olympics in skeleton, where she's going downhill at 90 miles an hour face first on a sled. You put her on a track that's been untested, and people will die. So there's a lot more behind the scenes. I wish it were as simple as a soundbite as a lot of politicians want, but it's a much more complex issue.
Once again, we are talking with 2008 Olympian Eli Bremer, who competed in Beijing. And to be clear, the UK and Canada have joined the diplomatic boycott that the United States had announced just over a week ago that we would be doing at the Beijing Games, Winter Games next year. So there are more countries that are lining up. And this is a final question. Then we'll shift gears and bring on Riley Scott into the conversation. Eli, what does it mean? What do you think is the significance that we have other countries that are adding on to this diplomatic boycott, and it is not just the United States handling this in this way?
Well, I think it's important. I think that we need to recognize the strategic threat China faces to America and the free world. I think it's great that other countries are joining in on that. When I competed in '08, there was an effort called Team Darfur that I supported, which was shining a light on China's transgressions in the Darfur region of the Sudan. They were supporting effectively a genocide there. I think that athletes are keenly aware right now on what's happening in Northwest China with the Uyghurs. A lot of Americans don't understand that very well. They understand there's a problem. Athletes are digging in on it. They understand it. And I think we're going to see athletes speaking out and using their voice to shed light on this. And frankly, Jimmy, I think a lot of Chinese don't know what's going on with the Uyghurs because they're headquartered in, or they're predominantly based in Urumqi, which is Northwest China. I've actually been there. It's a long flight. It'd be like flying from New York to San Francisco in terms of the distance from Beijing. And so I think a lot of the Chinese people don't even know what their government's doing. And having American athletes speak about it, Canadian athletes speak about it, other athletes speak about it is going to help shed light on the issue.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the more that you can rally the international community together to address and redress wrongs, and to be sure, the Chinese Communist Party is one of the greatest perpetrators alive today, around today, of human rights violations. It is so critical that you do it that way, that you bring together as many forces to make a stand as possible. Once again.